In last week's gospel, the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" If you remember, Jesus answered in two directions, to love God and to love your neighbor. And he went on to say that on these two commandments, love God and love neighbor, hang all the law and the prophets. So the issue, of course, then is not the law itself, but rather its interpretation and how we practice it. As Father Richard Rohr points out, religion is at its worst when it substitutes rituals for reality, the container for the contents, the wineskins for the ecstatic wine. While it's pretty easy to point our fingers at those Pharisees, it's helpful to know that the Pharisaic movement was actually a reform movement within Israel at the time of Jesus. The temple was at the heart of Jewish worship, but the temple was in Jerusalem, and it was controlled by the priestly class. In the opinion of the Pharisees, holiness was not only for the priest and the temple. By observing the purity code, every member of the people of God might participate in the holiness of God. Well, obviously, Matthew's Christian community is struggling with the same issues that Jesus' Jewish community was struggling with. So did you notice right in the middle of the gospel, Jesus stopped talking about those Pharisees and started talking directly to the leaders of the Christian community? But you, he said, are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. There's always a danger in religion of exalting and elevating the leaders, but Jesus turns that upside down. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. As Jesus himself shows on the way to the cross, the way to glory is the path of descent. Jesus practices what he teaches. He is the one who hands over his life for the life of the world. St. Paul's ministry among the Thessalonians, as we heard in the second reading today, is in direct contrast to the Pharisees who tie up heavy burdens and lay them on others' shoulders. As Paul related to the Thessalonians, we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. Paul goes on to say that although we might have made demands as apostles of Christ, we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. We might test ourselves on this. When was the last time you walked across a room and told a person, especially a younger person, or a person whose talents dwarf yours, that you admire them, that you admire what they're doing, that their gifts enrich your life, that you are happy that their path has crossed yours? James Hillman suggests that if we look at our lives and ask ourselves what has made us deep, we'll have to admit that what made us deep were not our successes or achievements. These brought us glory, but not depth or character. Depth, rather, comes out of our inferiorities and our failures, and this is what gives us character. Our scars are like the huge stones in a riverbed. They may do nothing but stay still and hold their ground. But the river has to take them into account and alter its flow because of them. It's precisely this which gives a river and a face character. In just about 2 weeks, Father Solanus Casey will be beatified at a Mass at Ford Field in Detroit. Father Casey was a Capuchin, a priest here in St. Bonaventure Monastery, the Capuchin community in Detroit. When he first entered seminary in Wisconsin, the courses there were taught in German. And because he wasn't German and didn't know German, he didn't do well at all. So eventually he came to Detroit. But the seminary courses here were like they were everywhere in those days. Theology was taught in Latin. So it's probably true that in the old days, priests learned more Latin than they learned theology. And Father Solanus was not good at Latin either. So it turned out, because he didn't do so well in classes, that when he was ordained, we don't do this anymore, but in those days, there was a Latin term, a simplex priest. What that meant was that he could say Mass, but he wasn't allowed to hear confessions, and he couldn't preach, because preaching was more dogmatic theology. So he ended up being the porter, that's the doorkeeper, at St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit. Now, in the old days, of course, we used to think of priests were the high point. If you wanted to be holy, you could be a priest. That was before the reform of the Second Vatican Council. The Council taught the universal call to holiness for all the people of God. But in those days, there were sort of steps to holiness. The priest, of course, was the top. There were the major orders, the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. And then, after that, there were 4 minor orders. So in those minor orders, you had, first was the acolytes, the servers. They were closest to the altar. Next was the exorcist. They were the ones that healed people, made them whole, brought them closer to holiness. Then was the lector, so we have the Word of God. And the very lowest position was not in the church at all. It was at the door. And so that's where Father Casey was. He was the porter. He was the lowest in the most humble job. And that apparently is exactly where God wanted him, because it was there at the door that people came to meet this humble priest who had the capacity to listen to people, to bring healing and comfort and hope. People would line up from 7 o'clock in the morning after morning Mass till sometimes 10 o'clock at night. They would come to seek his counsel. The late Father Michael Crosby, who wrote the official book on Father Casey's canonization, said that people who came to see Father Solanus agreed to do 3 things. 1, to believe. 2, to pray with faith. And 3, to make a promise. Father Solanus took the Lord at his word that if you prayed with faith, then even mountains could be moved. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened. But Solanus felt it was important that the person making the petition believed that healing could occur through God and had faith that it would. And so he asked people to make a promise. He was famous for this statement: thank God ahead of time. Give thanks to God even before you receive the promise. So we recognize it's all about God. Gratitude is the key then that opens the door of mercy. And instead of laying heavy burdens on others to carry without lifting a finger, Solanus helped people carry their burdens. But more importantly, he didn't just open the door. He gave people the key to open the door. He humbled himself, and in so doing, he lifted us up as well. Solanus lived most of his life in a pre-Vatican II church. Some of us will remember those days. Catholicism was pretty parochial. It was pretty much us and them. But for Solanus, he was pretty much ahead of his time, because true religion always means inclusion rather than exclusion. And so after a while, it wasn't just Catholics who were beating a path to his door. Protestants, Jews, and even atheists came to seek out Father Casey's guidance. In this, I think he foreshadowed the mission of the church that St. John the 23rd articulated in his opening address to the bishops at the Second Vatican Council. He said, as we open this council, we see as always that the truth of Jesus is permanent. Errors creep in, but vanish like fog before the sun. In the past, we've opposed these errors and often condemned them. But today, we prefer to make use of the medicine of mercy rather than that of severity. And here the Pope sounds an awful lot like Paul when he wrote to the Thessalonians. The Catholic Church in this council desires to show herself as a loving mother of all, benign, patient, full of mercy and goodness toward all who are separated from her. In chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel, the Pharisees criticized Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus responded, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I came to call not the righteous, but sinners." Just as the cross has both a vertical and a horizontal line, it points us toward God and then reaches out to include everyone. In Jesus, mercy and justice meet. The one who humbled himself lifts us up.